They might be revoicing it, actually. I used to work in a place that did that.
They did it.
Yeah. Pleasure.
Yes.
Encantada.
Gracias.
Pleasure.
Yes. Stay in touch.
Al buscar agua.
I'm rushing to the restroom.
Yes, me too.
For the late, yeah, for late, but also for late
January. And I hope you'll be at the workshop.
let me know afterwards.
Okay.
Will you stay for the rest of the week? Yes.
No, I'm just going to be there.
Okay.
Keep in touch there.
Yeah, with pleasure. Yeah, with pleasure. Yeah, I think I mean again, it's the best place. Oh, good. Thank you, Sabrina.
Sabrina, thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian.
You got through the line?
Yeah.
When did you get through? Sort of 9 o'clock-ish or something? I think people who arrived for 10 are still there. Oh, that's mine.
Oh, that's yours.
I mean, thank you so much.
Thank you. Happy to be here. And where is
Committee revive.
it would work, no? You don't think so? I think it is. What happened was not fair with the people who did the hard work. Some people really worked hard, spent a lot of time.
Sorry,
Yes,
Sabine?
Sabine. No, Sabine is the girl, she's the student. She left, she's outside maybe.
Okay. Well, I'm interested for the sharing for blockchain.
Yes. Amin, my name is Amin.
I mean, sorry.
Yes, sorry.
Yes, I'm interested for the sharing for the blockchain experience of Latin America. I'm from Venezuela. In my country, the government is observatory for this training name. It's not observatory. It's this is the constructor is the local land. What is the regulation for local project, the blockchain academic area and banking area. I'm interested for the sharing for your collectors, passion. It's possible to the working?
You mean like collaborate?
Collaborate, yes.
Collaborate for, and you are from which organization?
ISO.
ISO.
I'm local charter Venezuela.
All right, very good. And I think we should get out because there is another panel happening.
just say. Hi everyone, we'll probably give it another couple of minutes, just see if we get a bit more of a crowd.
We're not doing panels, actually. It's really room set up, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the overflow. Hmm? 2 minutes. Yeah, sure.
Okay, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to the RIR Open Forum. My name is Chris Buckridge. I work for the RIPE NCC, which is one of those 5 regional internet registries. And yeah, with this RIR Open Forum is something that we do most years here at the IGF, primarily as an opportunity to, well, give people a chance to learn a bit more about what RIRs do, what some of the issues that we're seeing and addressing in our communities, how we're doing that and how those processes work. We don't have a huge group here today, but I hope there's a few of you who maybe have some questions or some issues that you're actually interested in terms of what the RIRs do. We have Paul Wilson, who's the Director General of APNIC, is going to be leading, I guess, the discussion and the session today with a presentation which covers a lot of different topics, a lot of the different areas that the RIRs and their communities have an interest in. Paul, maybe you want to jump to the next slide there. This is actually, I guess, the table of contents for the presentation. So as you see, there are a number of quite different topics there. And we sort of thought we'd at least start off seeing if there are particular topics that people are interested in or have more interest in. We want this to be as much of an interactive session as possible. We might not be so interactive with this number of people, but at the same time, it might allow for a bit more of an informal discussion. So, can I get sort of anyone here have anything particular that they see on this that they're very interested in today or would like to learn more about or discuss? Introduction to the tab? Okay. Well, then there's, okay, we also might, we can do a tour de table and just sort of see who is here and what some of your interests or affiliations are. So, well, I'll kick off. As I said, my name is Chris Buckridge. I'm from RIPE NCC, originally from Australia, but based now in the Amsterdam office of the RIPE NCC. We look after a service region covering Europe, Middle East, and Central Asia.
Hi, Susanna Gray, NRO and IGF ambassador.
Hi, Maria Gallo. I'm from LACNIC, Latin American and Caribbean Internet Registry.
Yeah, I'm Paul Wilson. I'm the head of APNIC, the IP address for the Asia Pacific. As Chris said, I've got quite a bunch of slides here that I can present, but there is a lot of material, so in order to avoid boring everyone with a great deal of content, it would be great. It'd be great to make it more interactive and to find out if there are sort of particular issues of interest. Thanks.
My name is Akinori Maimura from JPNIC, Japan Work Information Center, which is one of the national internet registry under APNIC, and I also serve as the ICANN board of directors. Thank you.
Maybe we go down to that end, and maybe we can come back up the other side.
Hello, I'm Kasumi Sugimoto from Japan. I work for National Cybersecurity Center in Japan.
Okay, can we move along the line there?
My name is Philippe Tumba. I'm from DRC. I'm working in the Constitutional Court in DRC.
Habib Rashid from .tz Registry, AFRINIC board member.
Good afternoon. I'm Charlotte Spencer. I'm a legal officer at WIPO, and I work with many CCTLDs.
I'm Maria Svensson. I also work with WIPO together with Charlotte.
Hans-Petter Holen, and I'm RIPE chair, and just to confuse you a bit, RIPE is the open policy forum that sets the policies for RIPE NCC, so we have this separation between policy and implementation.
Dmitry Burkov, RIPE-C Executive Board. It's not about policy, but to control how they executed.
Anthony Golan, RIPE NCC Communications Specialist.
Richard Linning, RIPE NCC.
I'm the implementation guy at the RIPE NCC. Access Public Managing Director. Hello.
My name's Alan Barrett. I'm the CEO of AFRINIC.
I'm Pablo from APNIC, the Asia Pacific Network Information Center.
Hi, Corinne Kat. I'm a PhD student at the Oxford Internet Institute.
Hello, I'm Filip Vukovinsky. I'm a Diplo Foundation Fellow, and I'm the host for the online participants of this session. I'm also a member of Internet Society and alumni of Balkan School of Internet Governance. Thank you.
Can you see if we have any online participants?
Okay, we have a couple of additions down here if you guys want to introduce yourselves.
Sure, thanks. Ron De Silva, ICANN board.
Gui Wu, usually is I can board now is a board member for Zhonghua Telecom in Taiwan. Zhonghua Telecom.
Okay, so I think we have some slightly more diverse group even than I was expecting here today, so that's a good thing. Oh, one down the end. Oh, yeah.
Hi, sorry for the late arrival. Kevin Swift, Head of Strategic Relations and Integration at LACNIC.
Sorry, Kevin. Long room. Yeah, so possibly, based on some of the affiliations and areas, there might be some interest, certainly from the room in the last two items on this list, who is data accuracy and our engagement with law enforcement. But Paul, I'll hand it over to you to guide us through this.
I thought you were facilitating us, Chris. So I suppose, as I said, we've got there's plenty of content here to give you a huge amount of information about what's going on at the RARs and what we're doing, and it's mostly oriented towards what's been happening in the last couple of years, as these open forums are supposed to be, rather than a full explanation of what's being represented here. But I suppose, as Chris started to say, very interested to know if there are any particular topics of interest in the group that's here. Okay, well, I'll make a start then to talk about what the RARs are, and this part is mercifully short. Out of our experiences, that we can tend to overdo it when talking about the history of the 5 different organisations, how we got to be where we are, and why we're here and what we do. But in brief, the regional internet registries are the registry organisations that look after IP addresses, IPv4, IPv6 addresses, which are commonly known as internet number resources, along with autonomous system numbers, and we're responsible both for the distribution of those resources to those people and organisations who need them in our respective regions, and also for the public registration. So, as the registry name suggests, we provide a public registry to identify who are the holders of those internet number resources, and that registry function is very important, in particular for internet engineering and troubleshooting purposes, because as you may know, it's the numeric address that identifies both the source and the destination of a packet on the internet, and if you're witnessing any particular problem or issue on the internet, then normally you'll be able to identify that with a particular source IP address. And the point of the registry is for you to be able to take that source IP address and find out who has got operational control over that. Very important, as I said, for engineering, and these days more and more important for security purposes. So what are the 5 RARs? Well, today we have these are the 5 RARs. We are responsible for what was intended to be, back when the system was started, the RAR system was launched in the early 1990s, and it was established by the Internet Engineering Task Force that this number registry function should be regionalised, that regions would be of approximately continental scale, and that neutral and independent bodies, if they formed, they could take responsibility for those particular regions. So, as you see on the chart, 1992, which was very soon after that decision I mentioned, was when the RIPE community established the RIPE NCC to take responsibility for the European region generally. At the time, the central registry was located in the United States, but it became known as ARIN, as an independent registry, in 1997. APNIC followed soon after RIPE NCC in the early 90s, in 1993. And up until 2002, LACNIC was served by ARIN for the Americas. AFRINIC was split between ARIN and the RIPE NCC regions, but these days, as of 2002, we've got the LACNIC registry, we've got the AFRINIC registry. And so those are the 5 regional registries that make up the system these days. Now, the 5 registries are actually independent of each other. They are all non-profit, membership-based organisations operating in a bottom-up mode of governance, democratically elected boards of directors, etc., like you'd expect from a membership organisation. And what we can talk about later is also the governance process of the bottom-up policy development process, which also is associated with each of the 5 RARs. So we operate independently, but we actually do work together quite actively on various issues and aspects of our operation that deserve some coordination. So we've got a body called the Number Resource Organisation, or the NRO, which is a unincorporated association of the 5 RARs established under an MOU back in 2003. And so the mission of the NRO is pretty simple. It's to coordinate, where needed, RAR activities, joint activities which need coordination. It also acts to promote, again, what I mentioned before, the bottom-up multi-stakeholder policy development process and the multi-stakeholder model in general. So the NRO tends to represent that global set of systems in global forums like the UN forums. Thirdly, one of the cooperative activities of the RARs is to form another acronym called the ICANN ASO, the Address Supporting Organisation. So within the ICANN system, there's a structure of supporting organisations. The Address Supporting Organisation is the one that takes responsibility for the numbering issues, where the second N in the ICANN name, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. So one of our cooperative activities is to perform that ASO role within ICANN. And so if you'd like to learn more about the NRO, and then that's also a jumping off point for a lot of information about the 5 regional internet registries, then the URL is there. So that's the sort of nutshell summary of what the RARs are here to do and how we coordinate through the NRO. There is one of our recent sort of active projects has been the review of the ASO, the Address Supporting Organisation, within the ICANN structure. As a supporting organisation, the ASO has got a review that happens every 5 years. And so it's been a topic of interest, particularly for people particularly involved with the ICANN structure, to understand how the ASO review happened as it did last year and what its results were. So this next section is a little bit more detailed about exactly how the ASO is seen to be performing and what the ASO needs to do within the ICANN structure to fulfil its mission. So are there any questions about the RARs? Any comments that any of the counterparts, my counterparts, Alan, Axel?
Sounds like time to move on to the ASO review.
How many, can I just ask, how many people here have got a particular interest in ICANN and the ICANN model and ICANN structure? We have some ICANN board members here. Okay. Okay, well, the ASO, the Address Supporting Organisation, is one of 3 supporting organisations of the ICANN structure. So there's the GNSO and CCNSO are both names supporting organisations. The first for the global or generic domain names, the second for the country-specific CC, TLD names. And again, as I mentioned, the ASO is oriented to numbers and not names. And for anyone who's spent time in the ICANN world, I think you'd find that 99% of what ICANN does is oriented towards the names, all the processes around the generic names, the new GTLDs, and the management of that process along with the DNS services themselves. The numbers part is really a small part of what ICANN does, and there's a good reason for that, which is that the regional internet registries, the 5 of us, essentially predate ICANN and have had our own set of policy development processes and community conference activities for many, many years. And so while ICANN has got 3 big conferences a year, we've got 5 RARs, each of them holding 2 a year. So we've got 10 conferences that happen around the world, 10 meetings per year, which is where the RAR business is essentially performed, and that business being, the key part of that business being the policy development process. So that it's quite a different way or a different model for self-organisation in the naming world from the numbering world. But we do come together under ICANN or with ICANN for the sake of our dependency on the IANA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, which is now known as PTI. And we also, as I'll explain, have a reliance or a reliance on ICANN to perform a role in accrediting or recognising global policies that come through our respective 5 regional policy development processes. So I can talk about that as well. But this ASO review is, as I said, every 5 years we have an obligation under the ICANN bylaws to have a review, an independently conducted review of how this particular supporting organisation is run. So that's section 4.4 of the ICANN bylaws. It simply says that this periodic review must happen. On the other hand, in the agreement that we have with ICANN for the ASO to be formed, the actual conduct of the ASO review is in the hands of the NRO itself, but we still are required under that agreement to have that conducted as an independent review. So the objectives of that review are as defined to work out, to determine whether the ASO has a continuing purpose, whether any changes are needed, and also a big requirement in the ICANN world, I suppose, is to ensure that the accountability of the ASO to its constituents is still respectable. So back in 2012, we had the first review that was completed. The second review actually was launched last year. It ran through a fairly extensive process around the world of consultation in 5 regional internet registry communities. That was the review itself was conducted by a consultancy group called ITEMS, ITEMS, who had actually performed the first review as well. And then, so they conducted that review during the course of this year and presented their final report in August. That's been done. So yeah, as I mentioned, the ITEMS people conducted a bunch of consultations, face-to-face interviews with members of the RAR communities. They visited 2 separate ICANN meetings in the course of this review and 5 RAR meetings. They took responses from all regions and with an eye to the diversity of those responses according to different stakeholder groups. So jumping straight to the findings, the findings are quite clear that the ASO has a continuing purpose. The yes is at 83%, the no's at 6.8%, I think it is, and just a few maybes in the middle. So that's fairly clear. The second sort of major question is about the accountability of the ASO, and the accountability is fairly well regarded and trusted as well. Now, there are a few more specific findings. The ASO was regarded as one of the lesser-known supporting organisations in ICANN. As I mentioned, that's for good reasons. We account for a small amount of the business that happens in the ICANN framework. But we were regarded to be one of the better organised parts of the ICANN system, which was nice to see. Still some considerable misunderstanding about the scope of the different parts of the ASO, including the NRO, and how we relate to one another. And if anyone here is confused or stays confused about exactly what the roles and functions are of some of these different components of the system, then that's something that this review has agreed with. It's not entirely clear. There's a lot of history actually over the last decade or two that the system's been operating, so perhaps some complexity or baggage from previous sort of incarnations and aspects of the system as it's evolved. They reckon that the ASO has stood the test of time, but certain aspects of our MOU with ICANN need to be updated. They made 18 recommendations in 4 different sort of categories of recommendations. What the NRO is doing now for the RARs is to consider that review in detail, and we have actually provided a response that, in effect, our response is to take the 18 recommendations. The first 17 of them are fairly straightforward and easy enough to implement as not exactly trivial, but often administrative aspects of our setup and design, and those are able to be implemented fairly readily. Now we've been able to classify all of the recommendations according to the different types of recommendations and who it is that needs to act on them. So the recommendations might be for the NRO, the RAs collectively to act on, for ICANN, for both of us, or for the Address Council of the ASO, which is our policy coordination body within the Address Supporting Organisation. So 18 recommendations scattered across that sort of matrix of different types of recommendation and actionable by different parts of the system. The less trivial recommendation and the most important one is number 18, which we also accept, and that simply says that the RARs should initiate a public consultation across our communities to determine if any changes are warranted to the ASO structure in future. So that's something that's to be launched by the RARs respectively in the coming period. So that is the ASO review in a nutshell. Are there anything I've missed out on in that summary? Axel, Alan, Pablo, Chris? Any burning questions about the ASO?
Can you please say something more on the methodology? Because you mentioned face-to-face interviews. These interviews were conducted on the people that are in this organization.
The review was conducted independently, and there were a couple of separate individual consultants who, as the map showed, they travelled around the 5 RAR regions, meeting the primary stakeholders of RARs, which included members of RARs, also staff and other members of the community, and they also attended ICANN meetings and did the same thing. So the results of those interviews were kept anonymous and confidential, but the consultants, as independent reviewers, were charged with performing an analysis and writing a report. There's a lot more to the report, obviously, than I've been able to include in these slides, and you can find the details, which include a description of the methodology in more detail on the ASO website or via the NRO website.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Sorry?
Let's move on to the numbers.
Move on to the numbers. Okay. This set of slides is just in a slightly different format, so let me bring up the other set here. Something that has been of great interest in IGF over the years, and also we find outside of the outside of the IGF in a lot of different environments, a lot of different stakeholders, whether it's governmental, community, or industry. A topic of great interest has been this transition from IPv4 to IPv6. So IPv4 was the original addressing architecture of the internet, adopted in 1983, and providing what seemed at the time to be a massive amount of address space for the internet to be numbered with. The total theoretical size of IPv4 being 4 billion addresses. But that did seem massive and inexhaustible at the time, back in 1983. But in fact, the internet outgrew that. It outgrew that number of addresses quite a few years ago, even though you might think still 4 billion is big enough for the size of the internet. But due to not only the number of individual devices that need to be addressed, but also the way that the address space needs to be managed, it has sort of been in some state of shortage for many, many years now. It's been managed very carefully. It's also been distributed very carefully and used in a way that has tried to maximise its availability. Now, the point about the size of the address space is that as the internet started to grow into the early 90s, it was clear that we were going to run out of address space soon enough. So it was actually early 90s, a good nearly 20 years ago, now 15 plus years ago, that the next generation of the IP address architecture needed to be developed. It was developed again through the Internet Engineering Task Force. It was named IPv6. No one really knows what happened to IPv5, but we're going from v4 to v6 at the moment. That transition's been underway now for, as I say, for 15 plus years. For a number of different reasons, the transition has taken a lot longer than expected. It was optimistically expected to be more or less a sort of an automatic and an easy thing to do, but I think a problem that got in the way of the transition is largely to do with the success of the internet itself. The fact that between the time when IPv6 was developed and today, there was a massive boom in the internet, and then a period of since when the internet has been a commodity, providing very small margins of profit margins to its operators. The need for IPv6, or the transition to IPv6, has actually required a very strong business case in the past. So no internet provider in a competitive environment has really chosen to deploy and to invest in deployment of IPv6 before such time as they need to, because they've always got better things to do with their spare resources in developing markets and improving their competitive positions and so forth. So, long story short, the IPv6 transition has taken a lot longer than expected, even to the extent that until a couple of years ago there were, I'd say, genuinely felt questions raised about whether IPv6 was going to succeed at all. That the pace of deployment had just been very slow for a very long time. The point of this set of slides, though, is to show that that situation has changed very rapidly just in recent years. So, for anyone who might have some doubts about whether or not IPv6 is being deployed or can be deployed or will be, I think the answers to those questions are yes in all cases. Now, the reason that things have changed in recent years is because of this chart here, which shows the depletion of IPv4 address reserves across the 5 regional internet registries. So, going back to 2013, we actually had a respectable amount of address space available in all of the regional internet registries. That's changed very much into 2017, there, where all of the 5 lines of which represent remaining IPv4 pools have all started to approach the bottom. We've got a total of about 24 million, something just over 20 million IPv4 addresses are remaining, and once those are allocated, there will be nothing left. The significance of that is not that, as people have said in the past, that the internet will stop working in any sense, because the addresses that have been deployed, of course, continue to operate. It's actually about the ability of the internet to grow further, and for that, addresses are needed. So again, long story short, the drive for IPv6 has been the final, eventual, predicted, but slow exhaustion of IPv4 address space. So over the last several years, this rapid growth, there has been a rapid growth in IPv6 take-up. So going back just to a few years ago, we had something less than 2% deployment. These days we've got upwards of 15% deployment. That's across the entire internet user base. This chart actually refers to the number of users of the internet who are capable of using IPv6. So 15%, about 1 in 7 around the world, are being delivered an IPv6 service these days by their ISP. These slides come from APNIC, so I had the opportunity or the need to show how Asia is changing. A lot of folks have assumed that Asia would actually be in the lead in IPv6 deployment. That's likely to happen in coming years, but it's actually, as the chart shows, it's been relatively slow until at least until sometime in 2016 when it started to deploy. If we average IPv6 capability across the countries of the world, then we see that at the top is Belgium with 59% of Belgian internet users being IPv6 capable. India has very recently launched itself into second place with 51%, then followed by Germany, the US, Switzerland, Greece, Luxembourg, UK, Uruguay, Japan, Portugal. Something that's interesting about this is it's not solely dominated by advanced internet economies, that there are very much developing internet economies which have moved forward quite quickly. The other thing to bear in mind about country averages is that V6 deployment is actually happening from the ISPs. So there's very little that is actually happening at a country level that encourages or that has supported IPv6 deployment at a country level. It's really just the actions of individual ISPs that contribute to this chart or these figures. Japan has been assumed to be in the lead. Japan these days is at about 25% deployment. The US is at about, what does that say, close to 40% deployment over a much more graceful growth period. It's been, there are many large providers in the US that are using IPv6 these days, and they've been developing quite steadily over quite a few years. India recently jumped into the second place globally, purely on the basis of one ISP, a mobile ISP, Reliance Jio, that launched a massive free access data service that actually attracted what is literally hundreds of millions of subscribers. That's an IPv6 based service. So the blue line is Reliance Jio. That represents the growth of that particular service, and the orange line is the average for India, which is now topped 50%. Vietnam has done fairly well, again on the basis of not a mobile provider, but a cable internet service provider. Uruguay has jumped very rapidly recently up to the same percentage level as, a level that exceeds the United States, again just on based on the actions of one ISP providing mobile services. Another way to look at V6 deployment is not at the user capability side, but at the volume side, and this is IPv6 at Google, which has grown from 12% up to 20% just in the space of just over a year. So that's showing that the users who actually have IPv6 capability are also actually using IPv6 services in large numbers. So if you take 20% of Google's traffic, that's a huge amount of internet traffic that's flowing on IPv6 these days. Facebook has hit 50% of its volume being delivered on IPv6, at least in the USA. And that's a very good example again of the content side. We often get asked at APNIC how long this IPv6 deployment will take. One of our researchers did some research into this, looking at technology adoption that very roughly follows something called the sigmoid curve. The sigmoid curve in its theoretical form looks like this very elegant curve where you start off slowly, you accelerate, and then the last part of the growth towards 100% is then slower. But if we fit IPv6 deployment to the sigmoid curve, which we can do in this case, then we're looking at about 4 or 5 years of rapid growth now, but probably a long tail in which IPv6 will go on. IPv6 will go on growing slowly. IPv4 will naturally still be in use, really for possibly at least another decade or two. And that's IPv6.
Any questions on IPv6? Deployment, or I guess, Paul, I didn't see, and maybe in terms of v4 and the flip side to the coin is the IPv4 transfer situation that's now playing out in different ways in different regions. Is that, are we looking at that and how that plays against the deployment of IPv6 and where that's going?
I don't have any content on that in the slide pack, but it's a good question. It's something that's been of interest as IPv4 stocks have been depleted. IPv4 is no longer available in the large quantities that it was previously for the deployment of new networks, particularly at a governmental level. If governments have become aware of the fact that their own network services may be constrained by a lack of IPv4 address space, there's been quite a lot of interest in how IPv4, how the IPv4 internet can continue while the transition to IPv6 is underway. These days, if IPv4 is still obviously necessary in order for the internet to maintain its global interoperability. Every part of the internet needs some mechanism for access from the rest of the IPv4 internet. And when asked where new stocks of IPv4 can come from, there are just a couple of options left these days. One is that you actually have got, at least for the time being, you've got very small rations of IPv4 address space available from each of the RARs. That'll go on for at least a couple more years. The other option, however, is to look to an open market, which has only been available and operating for the last few years in different parts of the world, but it is now possible to buy IPv4 address space on the open market. In the past, there's been a suspected black market in IPv4 address space where people actually have undertaken to transfer the use of IPv4 space from one organisation to another, probably on some commercial basis. The trouble with doing that kind of transfer, which is outside of the registry system, is that the registries themselves become inaccurate then. So you've actually got IP address space being used in places where, or in situations where it is no longer tracked by the registry. So the regional internet registries have worked fairly hard in each region as the regional stocks have depleted to allow transfers to be registered. So if we have two parties who are, as a source and a destination of address space, both are willing to come to some arrangement where they want to make a transfer, then the RARs in most cases now will allow that transfer to be registered. Is that the case for all 5 these days? Afrinic is allowing transfers these days as well?
Yes, as from this year, Afrinic is allowing transfers, but only within the Afrinic region.
Right.
Okay, so...
Okay, so as each of the 5 regional internet registries has run out of its available stock, and in accordance with its own policy development process, the question of transfers has been addressed by each registry. So now the final one of the 5 that was yet to implement a transfer system is Afrinic, and it has done so. The other aspect of this is to provide inter-regional transfers, and they're also happening quite rapidly these days primarily between the ARAN region, the North America region, where there's been traditionally a large amount of historically allocated IPv4 address space, and between that region and Europe or Asia Pacific as the sort of main demand centres for new IPv4 address stocks. So that's the transfer situation at the moment. The idea of transfers is to continue to make IPv4 address space available to those who need it, and to draw it out, to provide the incentive for it to be surrendered by those who don't need it and who prefer a financial reward for making it available. So yeah, of course, the regional internet registries are tracking and reporting on the volume and the frequency of transfers as part of our general sort of activity reporting. So that information, those reports are available on the RIR websites and in other reports that we provide to the community.
If I can say, I guess the other third spoke there in terms of IPv6 address transfers, and then carrier grade NAT is the other option that we're seeing, and that's probably something to point out for people if there is an interest in that later in the week. There is actually an IGF workshop on carrier grade NAT, the use and proliferation of carrier grade NAT through which operators are able to use IPv4 to connect many more people than they have addresses. But that certainly raised some interesting discussions quite recently, where we're seeing LEAs like Europol, law enforcement agencies, and also even in the European Parliament, we're seeing parliamentarians actually asking specific questions about the use of carrier grade NAT and what that means. So I think that's another thing that certainly our RAR communities are very affected by and interested in, and that's being discussed here this week.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Quo.
Maybe it's too early to ask a question about that, but in somehow, if we look in the current trend, you are talking about the size is about 30%, the volume in the Google is around 20%, and Facebook is about 50%. If there is a continuing this trend and going on, let's say the IPv6 eventually will be, the volume of operation is much bigger than the IPv4. Usually in the past, all of 5RR, in the policy, we try to be careful about how the IPv4 distributed. But since if the IPv6 going to dominate in the internet operation, do you think we should modify or change the IPv4 distribution policy? Because right now we assume there is a run out, and so we control the IPv4 very careful. But when the IPv6 is really dominant, do we ever thinking about how we should thinking about what is the IPv4 policy going to modify again?
Well, it's a good question. It's a leading question, Quo, because what the standard response that you'll get from the RAR folks who are here is that it's not for us as staff of the registry organisations to actually determine what the policies are or should be, and so I think what I'd like to jump to here is some slides about participation in the RARs, because as I mentioned before, one of the primary focuses of our regular events is precisely to look at how the registries are actually serving their communities by actually providing services according to policies. So we have a set of policies that determine exactly how IP addresses, v4, v6, and also the associated autonomous system numbers, how those things are managed. And what the RARs do in providing an allocation and registration service is to follow the policies. And we don't invent the policies or modify the policies at the level of the registry or the organisation. The policies actually come from the community. So if someone like you, Quo Wei Wu, decides, and you can be simply an interested member of the community, not with any relationship, membership or financial relationship at all with the regional internet registries, but as a participant in the community, if you decide that you feel that IPv4 policies should now change for a particular reason, then you can bring that that proposal to any of the RARs to fly it up the flagpole and see how many people would agree with you. And that's something that happens very, very regularly at each of the 5 RARs. Twice a year, we have what are called open policy meetings within this open community meeting or conference environment, and that's where as the graphics are showing here, we have a policy process which is said to be open in that anyone can participate. It's transparent. It's fully and publicly documented. And it's, as we say, bottom up. It's something that's driven by members of the community who can come, who can make proposals into that process and have those proposals discussed and reviewed and hopefully eventually agreed. So we describe it as a cycle which starts with some sort of need for some change, a proposal, a consensus on the proposal through that open policy process, implementation, which is something that the RARs are responsible for, and then an evaluation, which actually is really in the hands of the community served by those policies. You know, it comes back to possibly the need to change or continue to evolve these policies. As I said before, the RARs follow these policies. We're bound to, and we can't do anything that contradicts the policies. The policy development process, the PDP, is open and accessible to anyone who's interested. It's important that each of the 5 RARs, being bottom-up, community-oriented organisations, we have an independent PDP in each region. So it is quite possible for different policy decisions to be made at different times according to need. But there is always quite an active cross-fertilisation and a sort of observation from one region of another to see what may be happening and what may be successful or needed in one region and how it might be translated into another. And the interesting thing is that in general, the policy development process of each RAR is a policy in itself, so it can also be adapted as time goes on. So each of the RARs, because as I said, this is a very important part of what we do, each of the RARs has got its own sort of set of policy activities, mailing lists, working groups or special interest groups, website documentation, and so on. One of the services or one of the activities of the RARs, one of the activities of the NRO, I'm sorry, is to actually compare the policy development processes of each of the. I see I've accidentally clicked on something here, and not a very good one either, according to this. Probably an old link in the presentation. One of the things that the NRO does, along with other similar comparative kind of exercises, is to publish a comparative matrix of the policy provisions of all of the 5 RARs. So it may come up particularly with a multinational or multi-regional service provider that they want to really understand better how policies in different regions might compare to each other. Something that comes up probably as well in the minds of regulators and policy people in a governmental environment, if they're drilling down into how IP addresses are being managed around the world in different places, then the NRO's policy comparison matrix can help to shed light on those things as well. Now, I understand we're going here until only 1:15, right? 1:20, 1:15. It leaves a few minutes for the burning questions.
Yes. We haven't really addressed much about the WHOIS accuracy or the law enforcement engagement, which is perhaps unfortunate. But
a few words on that. Would you like to say a few words on that, Chris?
I think it's probably better if you work with the slides you have there.
Okay. The policies of the RARs determine how we operate our services. The services really can be divided into sort of a number allocation services, including transfers and also registry services. So we actually, as I mentioned, each of the 5 RARs has got a public registry which shows which reports publicly and is available publicly to identify exactly where and how IP addresses are being used. One of the increasingly important stakeholders in those registries are the security and law enforcement agents who are dealing with cyber attacks, cyber crime, and so forth. And so all of the RIRs actually, I think, in their own region are involved quite heavily in liaison with, in education and exchange with law enforcement agencies in their respective regions and globally. And there's a little bit of information here about how we do that. The RIRs are involved. We are actually in the incident response chain. So where an incident, an online security or criminal incident has happened and the IP addresses have become an important sort of piece of information, normally in the process of attribution of some particular activity to a culprit or a perpetrator. The RIRs are in that chain. Our registries are used. We may be involved also in case of actually referring cases to law enforcement agents in answering and complying with subpoenas and court orders and so forth. So that's incident response. But in order for the LEAs and others, people in what's called the public safety community in general, in order for them to actually better use and to fully and properly understand the registry systems and services, we actually do a lot of training and engagement with that broad community. Specific training, technical training classes and outreach, policy work with governmental working groups and so forth that have an interest in, perhaps through the policy process, achieving some changes or refinements in the way WHOIS services are actually being run and managed. And also we cross over into groupings like the ICANN Governmental Advisory Committee, which has a public safety working group. So they use the term public safety as a catch-all for law enforcement, but also judicial officers and even emergency services and things like that, all of whom could be involved with a reliance on ICANN services. One of our interesting and important liaisons actually with ICANN is to be able to provide information about the numbering side into ICANN's public safety-oriented activities. So we're also trying to increase law enforcement participation in RIR processes, and in different regions we actually have had active participation from law enforcement agents in particularly in WHOIS related policy work, particularly in leading in the ARAN region with FBI involvement with ARAN meetings, also in the RIPE region where one of the law enforcement community members is with us in the room here. He's Dick Leaning is these days actually working on law enforcement liaison with the RIPE NCC and also at the other three RIRs to some extent or other. So we would be encouraging law enforcement folks to understand the policies, particularly WHOIS policies, what WHOIS is, what it can do, what it can't do, to engage with the RIRs through the policy process if they have an interest in refining or improving, in their eyes, how registry services are actually being operated. And one of the areas of particular interest these days is really both the accuracy of WHOIS data and the completeness of WHOIS data enabled in that registry service being able to answer the questions that the law enforcement and other public safety folks have got for the registry. And current collaboration work, as I mentioned, the up-to-date accuracy and completeness of WHOIS data, something that we are working and hearing a lot from law enforcement agents about. Why it matters from a public safety perspective, WHOIS is really important. The situation these days is that time is of the essence in a lot of the interactions that we have, where really public safety agencies do need to have a quick result, to get a quick answer to their request, which, as I said, is mostly for attribution of online activities to real people. We don't want them wasting their time on if they don't have to as stakeholders in our services. And yeah, so that's probably why it matters. I hope is clear enough. That's a very quick rundown of law enforcement. Yeah, Chris.
And I think we probably have reached just about the end of our time. We don't seem to be getting kicked out, though. So if there are any questions or comments that people have, it would be great to sort of, have a little more interaction. But otherwise, I guess it's just left to me to say thank you all for coming. I hope this was enlightening and that you learned something. And certainly, if nothing else, you've seen a lot of the RIR staff who are here on site this week, and we're all friendly people and willing to chat more about this and provide more information. So please do approach us if you have any questions that you think of after this or weren't really keen to talk about on the microphone. Enjoy your day, have a good lunch, and thanks again for coming.
Thank you. Cheese, right? Cheese.
This one is cheese, but you know, when you're in France, you know which option and you're vegetarian.
You're a bit of a fromageophile, aren't you?
I used to be, and then I moved to the US, and I found it very